Getting a movie greenlit, made, and released in Hollywood is a long, tricky process, and my next guests on this episode of Source Material know all about it. Producer Naomi Despres and writer John Gatins are part of the team behind the new movie Little Wing, out now on Paramount+. And it's the latest in a long line of pictures they've each worked on, and this one emerged from a story by Susan Orlean, plus a meeting with Steven Spielberg. We'll get into that process, which has turned out to be something of a coming-of-age story itself, and a lot more today. Source Material is a series from the Sunday Long Read podcast, an extension of the Sunday Long Read newsletter. If you like the podcast, you can support us by liking the episode or following us on your platform of choice, or all of them if you'd like. Now let's get on to our guests, Naomi and John. It's such a pleasure to have you today. How are you doing?
Good. We're good.
Doing pretty well, thanks. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, congrats on the project, which I said just came out on Paramount Plus recently for those listening. And as I mentioned, it was a long process to get from there to here. John, you've told the story a bit of meeting with Steven Spielberg just after Susan's piece and the request to write a script based on that story. And that was all the way back in 2006. So tell me about that meeting and what some of the fits and starts were from there to here.
I had, in 2004, I'd written and directed an original movie of mine called Dreamer for DreamWorks. And so it was a company I'd been working with and I had a good relationship with, and I had a little bit of a relationship with Steven. And he read this story, loved it, optioned it, and then, had me come in and chat with him. So we had this great meeting in his office. It was incredible. He's got all this cool stuff in there. He has the Rosebud sled in a lucite box on his wall. He has a Norman Rockwell self-portrait. I mean, it's like he's got really cool stuff in this office. So you're kind of lost in the sauce of how great this is. And we talked about War of the Worlds because he had just made that. And Dakota, who was in my movie, was in his movie. And we were all in the family. And then we got to the article by the very end where he was like, so the article, I said, oh, it was amazing. Susan Orlean, it's incredible. She's an incredible writer, blah, blah, blah. He's like, yeah, it'd be great, blah, blah, blah. And then quickly I was kind of done after an hour of just kind of, hanging with Steven. And then before I got to my car, my agent called and said, well, they want to make a deal. I said, for what? They said, to write this movie. I said, based on what? They're like, this story. I was like, this story is amazing, but I don't know what the movie is. It's a profile of a young woman that Susan met, and she met her in a dog park, and the girl had told her, I have racing pigeons. And so, and if you look at the article, which I really only looked, early on at, and it set me on, I couldn't say no as the end of the story of that story. So I got involved and went through the panic attack of like, what is a movie based on this? But I got to meet Susan Orlean, and she and I spent time together, and she was amazing and pointed me in the direction of pigeons and pigeon racing research. So I started to steep myself in the world of pigeon racing and wrote a script, and kind of it was nuts because Steven called me and loved the script and really was like, I want to make this movie. And I was thinking, I'm not sure Steven Spielberg is making this movie. It just didn't, it just seemed kind of small and kind of, but it was a bit of a process that he goes through, I think, where he tries everything on. So, and then through a series of strange business maneuvers, meaning the business of Hollywood moves around, and Paramount and DreamWorks, who had been linked, were suddenly no longer linked, and Paramount had paid for the development. So the script went with all the development to the shelves of Paramount, and I was kind of still in the world of DreamWorks. And so I stayed and wrote Real Steel for them because that was a project they kept. And so Little Wing just went away, disappeared.
Yeah.
2007, 2008, 2009.
Right. And it'd be about 10 years right before it really got active again.
I mean, there was little moments here and there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And Naomi, where do you enter the picture on this?
Well, interestingly enough, this is a rare instance where I entered the picture very, very late in the process, actually, and was the beneficiary of a lot of work that went before me. So I actually only got involved in this pretty close to the start of production. And by that point, we were really just dealing with how to take John's script, which was originally set in Boston, which is where Susan had originally met the main character, and John, of course, being from the area, there was a lot about the script that was deeply rooted in the authenticity of Boston. So,
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of ways, I was just involved in bringing the film to Portland and giving it, making sure that it was accurately representative of that world. And also, it had been so long, and we did have to essentially update the script. So there was that process of stepping into something that had been developed, 15 years earlier, and really recognizing all the ways in which the world was the same and ways in which the world had changed, and doing that kind of work with John and our director Dean Israelite on the script.
Yeah, I wanted to ask exactly about that, and I want to ask about the original adaptation work too. But on that editing or readapting process, I'm curious, for us writers in the world of journalism, one of the few benefits that we have, we're done with it. We don't usually go back and open things up from 10 years ago and tinker with them or look at what was missing. What is that like for you as a screenwriter, that process? Is that something you enjoy? Do you dread kind of reopening the script and updating it?
It's interesting because I think any screenwriter learns pretty quickly that real writing is rewriting, and it's a never-ending process, which can be really frustrating because I think it would be amazing to like write a piece, edit it, maybe get some feedback, but you continue to edit it, and then you have that moment of like, it's done. It's like done. It's like this is never done in the world of screenwriting. So it was interesting. I mean, the other thing too is I went to Boston and I met the young gal and her mom, and that was very early on before I wrote the script. So as Naomi said, it was informative to kind of go to Boston and kind of see that world a little bit. I'm from New York. So yes, I'm from that part of the world, but yes, there was some modernizing that needed to happen, and we made decisions, and Dean and Naomi and I had a lot of conversation with the studio too about like, we didn't want to have the world of cell phones. We were trying to set it in a world that was not necessarily telling you specifically what year it was, because, social media and everyone has a cell phone, and it's all so high speed data at your fingertips all the time. And we didn't really want that. So that was a consideration that we went back, because the look of the movie would be affected by it as well, so we kind of wanted a look that was a little bit worn out. Like it was written, that was the thing too. Now I'm remembering, it's like, it was the time when the mortgage crisis had kind of blown up. So like suburban towns all across America were really getting beat up by this bank moment. And we kind of wanted that to be an element of the movie. And I think the studio felt like, we can't make a period piece about 2007. It felt like that's not, that wasn't, we thought that was super cool. We're like, that's punk rock, let's do that. And they were like, no, they were not that into that.
I think that's an interesting, oh, sorry. I just at the end of what John was saying, one of the interesting things is when you go back and look at something, a lot of times it's the little things that have changed when you're trying to sort of bring something up to present day that's been written in the past. But those little things can have such huge effect on the movie, and certainly as it relates to technology. So we were really trying to find create a timeless feel. And fortunately our script has an element where the kid is not getting a cell phone in the beginning of the film. So we had permission to do that, which was, fortunate because it aligned with the feeling that we wanted to create for the film.
Yeah. And Naomi, I was going to ask you just what the role of a producer is in those conversations when it is, it's a story decision, but it's also, the studio is parts of it. Where do you come in and how do you help solve those riddles?
I think sometimes the role of a producer is to talk a writer and a director off a ledge. And to just sort of keep the eye on the ball of like, yes, we have an opportunity to make the movie here. How there's always a way to thread the needle. There's always a solve and a fix. And sometimes, this question of actually the time period was a really tricky one. because I think it's fair to say John and our director were really invested in the periodness of it originally. And that is something that the studio didn't want to do. They were okay with this idea of a timelessness. And of course, I had just joined the team. So I was kind of like, I really want to try to help get this movie made, but I don't necessarily feel that I have like a ton of I don't have a lot of skin in the game at this point. So it was sort of an interesting dance in the beginning, but it actually, I think, set us off on a really great path because we managed to get through all of that and really find a way that we all got excited about. So I do think, I don't know, John would probably be better to ask what a producer does. For me, again, it's unusual to step into something so late in the process because I usually develop things for many, 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 many years before I make it. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
all right, John.
that's very well said. I mean, because like little decisions like that mean everything. And it's like, if you're not going to be specific about what time it is, and we're going to go to timeless, which was basically where we landed, Dean and I were kind of on the side of fighting for, we want it to be 2007. And the studio was like, we'd rather it be modern day, use modern music, whatever else. So we landed in this timeless place. But you still have to answer questions because you have people looking at you going, okay, we're the picture car people. It's like, so no Teslas. It's like, no Tesla. It's like, you have to kind of, be really conscious of everything that you see: fashion, music, cars, transportation, everything that's going to kind of inform the movie. Music was very big.
Yeah.
And, I think that we did kind of pull it off. It was a bit of a challenge, but it kind of, and not a lot of texting. There's no texting really. It's just all of those things that we kind of bristled against because we're like, we just don't want the movie to go in that place. We don't want that. And as far as what a producer does, it's very funny because there are creative producers who never leave their desk, who just give you a lot of creative notes. And then there's producers who literally like carry cameras up hills. It's like, who are like, I'm here to make a movie. Naomi does both, which is really kind of the brilliance. Because she can surely hang in any kind of intellectual chat about the creative content of the movie, and can also like completely hang in the world of physically producing the movie, which she did both roles on. And she did jump in right. It was like, she calls it the shotgun wedding, because I called her and I said, look, there's Dean Israelite's a guy that I love, who I've made a movie with. We're going to make this movie. I can't go. You have to come and do this. And she was like, well, maybe I should have coffee with him. I was like, yeah, that'd be good. Do that. And then like they were on a plane together in 3 days to Portland. So
it's amazing. And as you're making those decisions, what is the role of the original story and the original writer? I mean, is that something you're going back to? You have the script, that's kind of in the past for you.
I mean, I always say that, a friend of mine teaches a film class, and he had me Zoom with them recently, and they were asking me questions. And I said, listen, here's the thing you need to know. My experience. When you're a screenwriter and you start out and you're writing a movie for yourself, you're God. You get to play God. You create everything. They rely on you for what they do, what they say, where they go, what happens. The second somebody else enters the equation, somebody's paying you, you cease playing God. Somebody else has a little bit of the God role. I was like, then there's more gods, and like it continues to go. So I think that, Susan's story was such a great launch of a really cool world. She's such a brilliant writer, and it's part of the allure and attraction and pitfall sometimes, because you want to honor that, but you have to take one medium and bring it to this other thing that's like much bigger, longer, has scope, has action, has all these things. So the script evolves through time. Casting can affect the script. Location, as Naomi said, it's like, I so wanted Boston because I wanted Fenway Park to be a character, like at night, the Green Monster and this whole thing. And we had to go to Portland for financial reasons. And then, Dean and Naomi found some incredible stuff that changed moments in the movie that were really filmmaking choices that, like the heist got changed, just the action of what happens, kind of in the heist. And it's some of my favorite moments in the movie that that were really, really driven by the location and the ability to film make, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And as someone who's based in Boston, I'm always game for a Boston movie. Ton of Boston movies, so it's nice to spread the shine around a little bit
Yeah.
as well. For does loyalty to the original story and characters play into this for either of you, or how, of course, of your career, learn to balance, being respectful, loyal to the original story while recognizing the changes that are needed to make it a successful film?
I think it's interesting because it is a very to answer your prior question. I feel like it's the source material is always on your mind, even if it's not at the forefront of the conversation. It's always sort of on your mind, back of the mind. It sort of floats around there, and it is kind of the North Star in that it's what is the thing that everybody dove into originally. So you have to somehow capture that, represent that. And because to just, throw it away is to abandon whatever that compelling first spark is, which is so important, I think, to the success of any adaptation. So I do think but obviously, film is its own medium. In this instance, Susan was introducing us to characters and a world, and elements of a story, but there wasn't a full-born story there. So it's very different, an article or a short story versus a whole film. And so in this instance, it was a really beautiful marriage between Susan's original inspiration and then John's storytelling, and then John also bringing elements of his own life and experience into it. And I think that and then obviously I've worked on things where the truthfulness of the story is really important, and then it's like you are really kind of calculating every move so carefully. If there is some sort of, if you really feel, I made a movie about journalists. I knew journalists were going to be scrutinizing that. But in this instance, what I would say, and I think what's kind of wonderful about Susan's work is that she just has an eye and an ear for amazing worlds and characters. And it's like she creates a playground and then the writer can come in and play. But it was really important to us that the original material felt represented in the work. And fortunately, Susan really loved the movie. I think it's kind of what she had hoped it would be. I think she would say that. So that's a win.
Well, yeah. Well, I know she was at the premiere. What was did she screen it beforehand? What was her kind of final weighing in like?
Yeah, she definitely saw cuts of the movie as we made our way through post-production. She spent about a week on set as well. She had a pre-existing relationship with Brian Cox because, of course, he was in adaptation.
Right.
And they had lived together near each other, not together, but they were neighbors at one point in upstate New York. So they had their own relationship. And Susan actually has an interesting history with Portland. It's, as she says, it's where she made her career as a journalist, because after college, she moved there and she worked for the local paper. So she was thrilled, and she has a bunch of, family and friends there. So she was so thrilled to be in Portland. So she was very much a part of the process, I would say. Yeah. Which is easy because she's a delight.
Yeah. True.
Fantastic.
Go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to add that, Naomi's right, because sometimes, like, I'm working on something now that's a novel that's like a twisty, thrillery kind of, and it has a following. It was, in my opinion, kind of a trashy, beach ready book, and we're trying to elevate it a little bit, and we kind of deviated too far because the gods in our universe kind of looked at a draft and said, you kind of invented a pretty big character that doesn't exist in the book, and we're not sure that we can do it. We're like, okay. So we had to kind of come back closer to the center that this book was. So when there's a story that, if it's a John Grisham novel, it's like, you better deliver, right? Because there's a certain value in that IP, because if you're buying a ticket to go see that movie, you better give me what I'm buying. And as Nay said, it's, this was a short story that was kind of this just cool moment in time. She captures these worlds. She'll tell you she loves to find these funny kind of subworlds and like go into like the idea of pigeon racing and the fact that a girl who's only 12 years old would be involved in a sport that like is mostly, 70-year-old white guys in t-shirts, or however she says it, which is pretty funny. So yeah, there wasn't any kind of mandate to stick to because there wasn't a story. So it was a world and a lead character, and then it was kind of like story elements that you pull out of a box, and then it was like go. Like I think I said, Jan Vari was my high school health teacher, so
Yeah.
and a Vietnam vet, and a guy that I worked for over the summer. So it's like a man that I got to know very well, and I kind of just like borrowed from that experience to kind of create a character that could be the person she bangs up against in the movie.
Hello, I'm Albert Samaha. I'm an award-winning journalist at the Washington Post, most recently of the book Concepcion, and the guest editor of the Sunday Long Reads True Crime Spotlight newsletter. Check out our monthly newsletter, where I'm curating the best true crime stories, from thrilling narratives through little-known underworlds to investigations that expose corporate or police. You can subscribe at sundaylongread.com/truecrime. That's sundaylongread.com/truecrime. Hope you'll join us. Peace.
I wanted to ask about a couple of the other real life projects you guys have shepherded. I mean, I'm guessing what you were referencing was Kill the Messenger, right?
Yeah.
Can you speak a little more about how you got involved in that project, which, for us, the journalism fans in our audience will be familiar with probably?
Yeah, that one was a very, very long journey. And I had a working relationship with the writer turned writer-director, Peter Landesman. And we were developing a few things together. And he and I started my career off a long time ago working for Oliver Stone and Janet Yang back at the height of their company's sort of run. And we did a lot of true stories. And I just was always drawn to that. And I met Peter and we were developing a number of true stories. And then he brought me the Gary Webb, the Nick Scow book, Kill the Messenger. And we developed that for years. And yeah, that one in particular, Peter has a background as a journalist as well. So he actually re-reported the whole story. So there was a whole long period of essentially re-reporting the story and then carving out the screenplay. In that instance, we also ultimately got the life rights from the Webb family. And the participation of the Webb family was really, really important. For those who don't know what the story is, the story of Gary Webb, who wrote what became a pretty controversial story about essentially the collusion between the CIA and narco traffickers who were, bringing crack cocaine into the U.S. in order to fund, various military activities. It was quite controversial at the time, and Gary Webb's career was destroyed as a result of it. And very sadly, his life, ended in a suicide. So the stakes were very high all the way around, in terms of the subject matter, in terms of what we were saying about the world of journalism, and certainly in terms of Gary, his memory, and getting the facts of his story right, for also representing for the sake of the family. So that's a really interesting experience in and of itself when you're dealing with family members of a deceased person who are also helping you to make the film, but you also want to just tell the story that you have to tell. You can't be in the business of just wanting to satisfy the family. You have to tell the story that you set out to tell. So it is a very complicated process. It's there's obviously a lot of lawyers that get involved in a situation like that as well, who are vetting the script and making advisements. And yeah, it's a super, super, super complicated process. And yeah, I'm very proud of that film, though. It was an incredible experience to make that film. Yeah,
absolutely. And you mentioned briefly, but I'm curious how different it was working with someone that had that journalism background himself and how that impacted that process.
Well, first of all, he felt such a deep connection to Gary. Peters also had written a piece actually for the New York Times about sex trafficking, and people had come after him and questioned his sources, and he knew he had also had that experience and the sensitivity of relying upon your editors, sometimes feeling betrayed by your editors. He had really lived a version of the story, not as extreme as Gary's. But so he there was a deep, deep, deep personal connection there for Peter. And I think a lot of that is in the script.
John, I wanted to go to you. Coach Carter's also based on a true story, but from what I can tell, not adapted from a book or a pre-existing piece of storytelling. So I'm curious how that process is different, maybe more freeing or more challenging in certain ways.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because I spent a fair amount of time with the man himself. And he was a really interesting guy. And Richmond, California is a very interesting part of the world. So seeing it was really, really something. And seeing the high school, and I got to meet some of the actual players. But the coach, Ken Carter, really gave us a full tour. And so we really got his side of the story. And that's basically the story that we told because, he did this thing where he locked his team out of the gym and said they had to study because they had signed contracts that they would perform at a certain academic level or they wouldn't get to play. So when he did that, and AP put a little thing out, said, hey, this basketball coach in high school locks his players out of the gym because they didn't get grades that were to this contract. Katie Couric was in the parking lot the next day, along with 500 other Stinger vans that were like, we're here to cover this story because it was just a story that just struck everybody in a way of like, I need to know more about that. So looking back, do I think that Ken Carter knew exactly what he was doing? I do, actually, because he was really an interesting guy who was trying to capture a moment, like a media moment in time, and he genuinely did. I think that now, if you asked the players who played for him, like what they thought about that experience and hear their story from their side, it might be slightly different. So your question is, based on a true story is also a big sell point for studios, right? Is to say, hey, oh, this is a really true story that like you're really going to be fascinated by. Well, I would say history is told by the survivors. It's like, so whoever you put the microphone in front of is going to tell you their opinion of what happened. And there are other sides. And, I went through it on this movie Hardball, which was based on a book about a man's experience coaching in a inner city baseball league in Chicago. I changed that character significantly for the movie because he was a trader. He worked in Chicago Board of Trade. Like he was a young guy who was, his firm kind of put him up to it. I made the guy like a scoundrelly kind of gambling, drinking, ne'er-do-well. So that's, I never got any flack. It was just like, look, we took a starting point of a book and, we kind of changed some things around. So anytime I see a movie that's like based on a true story, I have my own opinion going into it from my own experience. It says, well, there's probably going to be a lot of things that are factual. It's like, that guy did exist. They did meet each other. It's like this thing did happen, but I know that on the fringes, there's a little bit of spin that has to go on as well. I think, just my opinion.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. Given that, I'm curious what for both of you, what your interest is in journalism today, how much you read, reading it otherwise, like how's that evolved given the work you've done adapting some of this material?
You're always looking for material, and
Mhm.
people do like true stories. So, and journalism is an amazing, source, obviously,
Mm.
because I mean, I turn on my computer every morning, and these home pages I have, like, just have these weird little bylines of like this thing happened or that thing happened, and so you just kind of start like digging in and looking and looking, and you're always like, because as a writer, I mean, as a screenwriter, I've lived my life for 35 years, like constantly throughout my day going like, is that a movie? Is that a movie?
Mm.
Is that a movie? Is that a movie? And I think Naomi probably same as a producer, because everything you read, every magazine, every novella, every, news piece you see, or NPR story, or anything that you come across, you're constantly thinking that could be a movie. That could be a movie, or a series, or a limited
Yeah,
series, or a streaming
Right.
movie. It's like the world changes.
yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I really, I so admire the intrepid journalists who tug at a little story and then keep following it
Mm.
and keep following it. And um, especially in the world that we live in now, where it's all headlines and all distraction, the kind of dedication that it takes for a journalist to do a lot of the work of really great journalism is sort of that old school gumshoe, make a call, somebody who knows somebody, go back, double check. And it is incredible what comes out of that is has a certain power. It just does. Like, there's kind of nothing like the truth, which isn't to say,
Mhm.
I mean, there's wonderful, wonderful films that are purely fictional, many of my favorites. But there is something when you find a story, when some journalist has like pulled up a rock and found something that just has that ring of truth. And you're like, of course, this, I never would have thought about this, but of course it exists. There is a kind of thrill to it. So, I think we're all always looking for those stories. And, yeah, and God bless the journalists who are still out there doing it. It is tough times for journalists right now, but we really need that kind of dedication from them. Yeah.
Yeah. What is the appetite for journalism movies right now, having made Kill the Messenger and worked on a bunch of other projects related in the past? What's the interest in telling the stories of reporting on screen right now?
It's interesting. I don't know that I can answer that question, but I do. It's an interesting question to consider because journalism has changed so much, right? So
Right.
you think about
Talking
a
about
movie
cell
like
phones before, it's totally changed the job. Exactly.
right, and you think about a movie like Kill the Messenger, and you kill a movie like Spotlight, or I
Mhm.
mean, the Post. They're great stories about journalism. I know there are great stories about journalism taking place right now too.
Mhm.
Um, but I also think that the role of journalism in popular culture has shifted because we live in this age of sort of fairly superficial, disposable journalism. Um, and, I mean, one of my favorite movies, gosh, I'm blanking on the name of it, but of course, Mel Gibson, um, he's a journalist in, God, you guys must know. Anyway, whatever. So many of the movies that drew me in very early in my career, and
The Year
even
of Living Dangerously,
Year
is
of
that what you're
Living
talking about?
Dangerously. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Before I even knew that I wanted to be in the film, the films that really
Mm.
tugged at me were movies about journalists. So I do think it's a very interesting, provocative question that I've not thought about, and I don't really have an answer for. But because journalists are play a different role, and those kinds of real heroic journalists are fewer and far between.
Mm.
It's interesting to think about.
Yeah, and as Sean mentioned, they make great characters, right? Because they kind of are going into these worlds and kind of showing, learning about them, and at the same time the audience is. I think it's like a pretty compelling narrative structure to it as well. So, and it's something we always enjoy watching here. So, hopefully more to come.
I'm
One of the things.
I'm certain there will be more.
Good. I'm glad I got to hear it. What do you guys think of the term unadaptable? It's something that's kind of thrown around. It's thrown around a lot in like the sci-fi world. Do you come across stories that you love, but you either are told it's just not going to work on screen?
Sometimes because it's too expensive, certainly in the sci-fi world. Although that, with the dawning of AI technology as it relates to moving images, maybe the price point of some of these things will come down and everything will be adaptable from that perspective. I think mostly when I heard the term unadaptable, it's because, there's almost like too many things going on. And the very nature of it is that kind of like, it is to have kind of those many perspectives, but now maybe that's adaptable as a limited series or something like that.
I think if stories don't have, it's one thing to find an interesting character, which this is kind of, talking about Little Wing. Susan came across something that really like sparked her interest. But when I say there's no story there, it means like a lot of times you say there's no third act. It's like, what happens? What's the end?
Right.
It's like, what do you take me on? So a story is one thing, a world, a character, something that's fantastic, a slice of life. I mean, I watch a lot of news, right? And some of those stories are just slice of life. It's like, wow, look at this. We found this incredible bakery in the middle of nowhere and they make the greatest bread that anyone's ever seen. I'm really intrigued. I'm like, that's amazing. Look at these people who do this thing and they grow their own this and they grow their own that. It's like, that's an amazing slice of life. But unless there's a triple murder or unless they're conspiring to take down the government, it's like there's not a story that I think begs to be told, in a cinematic way. But that doesn't mean that you can't take that bakery and make them spies,
right?
With a plot to take us down.
Yeah, that's a really good point, John. It's like, again, that kind of question of the North Star. Like if you read something and you go, this is a really hard adaptation, but there is I can see like why you would do this, whether, and mostly it has to do with character. And I think with Little Wing, the reason why John said yes, in addition to Steven Spielberg telling him he had to say yes, was because there really is, if you go back and read Susan's piece, there really are great characters there. And there's something very moving about a girl who is at this very tender, vulnerable moment and feeling kind of lost and that age where like everything is so uncertain, finding a kind of comfort and center in this strange way. I mean, it's so, yes, it was hard for John, I'm sure, to get from the article to the script, but that character like compels. I just did an adaptation. Actually, I have a film. It's a Scandinavian movie. And I don't know when exactly it will come out in the US, but it was an adaptation of a very well-known author actually in Scandinavia and in Sweden in particular, Håkan Nesser. He's a giant author there. And I read the book, the screenwriter sent it to me and I was like, I think I might have used the word unadaptable. And she was just like, no. And what was interesting about that is the adaptation meant excising, like we probably 2/3 of the book is gone. And just sticking with this one part that was rooted in character as the spine of the movie. So the adaptation is really different from the novel. And it'll be interesting Håkan Nesser loves it, but we'll see how the fans of the book respond to it. I think they'll love it too, but it's very different than the book. But that seemed, for me as a producer at first, I was like, oh, this is going to be really hard to adapt, like maybe unadaptable. But she was so connected to that main character, and we found our way through. So I don't know, maybe nothing is unadaptable if, as John said, there's a great character at the center.
Yes, absolutely. Fantastic. Well, you guys have been really gracious with your time. I want to ask one last question. I'm curious for each of you, what challenge you're thinking about most right now, whether it's a project specific, whether it's, we've talked about a lot of the little things that need to be solved to make a movie, or whether it's a bigger thing about, your concerns about where storytelling is or where it's going that you're thinking, What challenge is on your mind these days, John?
I think you kind of hit it. It's this landscape of where do we tell these stories? So like the idea of the cinema experience, buying your ticket, sitting in a theater with a bunch of people you don't know, going on a ride. Like that's the business that I grew up in on my side of the desk. And that's been compromised by COVID and commerce and the world of streaming platforms and people watching, huge movies on their tiny cell phones. So we're a little bit, in my opinion, in a place of scratching our heads saying like, how do we do both or pick one lane or let some things go? And what is the state of modern visual storytelling right now? I think it's a big question on everybody's mind that we're not really sure. So.
Yeah, I would.
Naomi, how about you?
Yeah, definitely. There's no question, but that everyone who's certainly on the filmmaking side of the business is really thinking about sort of the distribution conundrum. At the moment, the thing that is on my mind is I'm trying to do something I've never done before, which is to make a independent film that is a musical.
Wow.
So I'm trying to think
Amazing.
about how actually to get that movie made. The distribution side of that is actually something I have to think about in advance. And it's interesting too, to think about like the different audiences and where they're at. Cause I think that's another thing. There's a generational thing that's happening too, where different generations are kind of have an appetite for different things. There's still the movies that satisfy everybody, but, there's also like, which is true all the time. But I think increasingly as distribution becomes more niche, you really have to think about like, who is my audience for this particular thing? And, which you've always had to do, but now I think even more so.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think both those challenges are for us as written writers too, thinking about the distribution and the business side of things and thinking about the audience and like you're saying, it's not a national magazine anymore. It's very specific. Or bringing a story from one place and introducing it to other folks is something we think about a lot. So again, Little Wing on Paramount Plus. Everyone should absolutely check it out, as well as some of the other work that we mentioned and everything to come from both of you. We can't wait for it. Naomi and John, thank you so much for joining.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you
for having us.
Thank you.
This episode of the Sunday Long Read podcast was produced by Etienne Lajoie. The co-founders of the Sunday Long Read newsletter are Don Van Natta Jr. and me, Jacob Feldman. If you like the podcast, you can support us by following us on your favorite platform. And make sure to check out the newsletter if you haven't already. You can subscribe at sundaylongread.com/subscribe. Until next time, thanks so much for joining us.